Welcome to Expansion and Growth, Finding Clues in the Federal Census from 1850 to 1900. This session is made available through RootsTech 2021. My name is Michael Strauss, and I'm an accredited genealogist in the Mid-Atlantic region of the United States. This is part one that covers 1850 to 1870. This will be continued with part two that covers 1880 to 1900. I began doing genealogy research in 1977. I was a young 12-year-old. And one of the very first records that I was ever introduced to was the United States Census. And because of that, I really wish that I had an understanding of the history behind it and had an understanding of why we even took the census. So I think it's important that we have some discussion as to the background and the history behind our United States Federal Census. The census was actually first authorized inside of the United States Constitution. This is found in Article 1, Section 2. However, it was officially established by an act of Congress called the Census Act of 1790, dated March 1 of that year. We should know that the census was used for political and for congressional reorganization, that the census was taken every 10 years since 1790 to the present time. But there is some privacy restrictions. There's a 72-year hold on the census, which makes only up to now 1940 is available to us. The 1950 will become available on April 1st of 2022. At the bottom, you see a logo. This is when the United States Census Bureau was officially established on July 1st of 1902. Prior to that date, when the Department of Commerce had taken over, the Department of State, followed by the Department of Interior, and finally the Department of Commerce, all had charge of keeping our census, keeping those returns, and tabulating that information. Before we get into the returns themselves, I want to share a couple other additional census facts. The 1830 census was the very first one that used the standardized forms. These forms were essentially handwritten with few exceptions prior to 1830. There were, however, a number of non-population schedules that were recorded. First of which was in 1820 with what was called the manufacturing schedule. This was a schedule first recorded then there was a short period where it was broken and again picked up between 1850 and 1880. There was slave schedules recorded between 1850 and 1860. Again, this ends with the passage of the end of the Civil War, and slave schedules are no longer a part of our Constitution. We have also a number of other non-population schedules between 1850 and 1880, with an additional one for 1885 covering some of our territories that dealt with agriculture. This is farming, mortality, which related to death, and finally social statistics, which gave information about the area where our ancestors lived. There was also a time period in 1880 where the very first women were allowed to be enumerators. In 1880, there was something called a special schedule that was taken. It was called a defective, dependent, and delinquent schedule, often referred to as the DDD schedule. And then in 1885, a mere 5 years later, we see our very first real territorial schedule done by the United States. And again, this doesn't take into account all the territories, but several of the larger ones. And of course, in 1890, we know that the 1890 was taken at that time, but we should also know is that in decades later, in January of 1921, that census was destroyed by fire while it was housed in the Commerce Building. We should also know that in any of these returns that are part of this session and part two, there is always going to be help for us to be able to know a little bit more about the returns, to have an understanding of what questions the census taker had to ask. There are always instructions that were provided. The United States Census Bureau has online for free PDF copies that you can download, giving you the instructions so you can better understand the questions. Once we have an understanding of the census itself, the history behind it, I think we need to have some discussion on where to locate these records online or on site if we're going to a library or an archive or even the National Archives. There are a number of online sites that you can search either free or by paid subscription, keeping in mind that they're each going to offer different records. They're not going to be consistent between each and every site. Some sites will offer less information, some will be more complete. It's up to you as the genealogist to determine which best suits your purposes to be able to locate the census material that you are seeking. A number of the top fee page sites are Ancestry, Fold 3, Heritage Quest, Genealogy Bank, amongst many others. Some of the more popular free sites are FamilySearch, followed by Internet Archives, and even including Cindy's List, where you can find a number of links to free material. Again, become familiar with each of these sites individually and see which works best for you as you delve into your family research a little deeper. Genealogy research looking at these census returns is going to be able to give you clues that you may not have known about your family and is likely to lead you to more intermediate or advanced records. So we're going to start first with the 1850 census. The 1850 census was taken on June 1st of 1850. The population of the United States at this time that the return was taken was over 23 million individuals. There were 31 states enumerated. And since the previous decade of 1840 through 1850, there were several states that were newly added. Florida and Texas had been added in 1845. Texas, obviously, as a result of what was to become the Mexican-American War of 1846. Iowa would follow in 1846, followed by Wisconsin in 1848. And then finally, California was added in 1850 as part of the Compromise of 1850, passed by Congress in September of that year to avert a civil war between the southern and northern states. This census also included 4 separate territories. Now, I want to share information about each of the returns and then show you an example of each. The 1850 return is shown here, just a blank return. This was the very first census that enumerated every single person in each household by name. We don't know the relationship yet to head of family. That will come later, but we at least get every name in the household. This is the first census that will also include the birthplace of every individual in the same household. You get the names, you get their birthplaces, you get their ages. You're going to get a lot of good information. Prior returns from 1790 to 1840 employed what was called using tick marks. We no longer are using tick marks in these census returns. These are actual data points that are now being asked. This is the first census to record age, gender, and color, for the most part, found in census returns. And this really targets free persons of color. This is clearly not including slaves, as they have their own schedule. This is also the very first census that asks the value of real estate. This is real estate property, real property that's owned by individuals. So if someone owned property, they were not renters. This is actually asking the value of the property. It also asked about their profession, their trade, their occupation. And this was for persons who were 15 years of age or older. But this was assumed to only include males. It was not made clear that this would include females at all. This would come later with clarification in the 1860 and the 1870 census. This would include males only. I have an example from one of my own family members. This is George Waltz, who is my direct ancestor. He lived in Lebanon, Pennsylvania most of his life. He was a book merchant for a number of decades. And you can see him listed here with his family unit. He's listed with an Elizabeth Waltz. He's listed with a young child named John. I only can make the assumption, because I don't know the relationship, I make the assumption that this is his wife and their child. Their ages are listed, their places of birth are listed, his occupation is listed. I also know that he's a renter. He does not own his own property. These returns were pretty easy to read. They were pretty easy to decipher. Now, I mentioned about some of the special schedules, at least early on. One of those special schedules that related to slaves was the slave schedules found in both 1850 and 1860. This again would end with the American Civil War. Now, these slave schedules were unique because the slave schedules enumerated the slaves, but it didn't enumerate them by name. However, it did list the slave owner by name. Slaves were listed by their age, their gender, their color. It stated whether they were black or mulatto. Again, just to recap, this was not by their names. It also asked the number of fugitive slaves for each owner. Now, this is an interesting question because this census return would have been later used with the passage of the Second Fugitive Slave Act, the first being in 1793. This was now a much tougher act passed by Congress, and the same marshals that took the returns would be the same marshals that would go out and catch the fugitive slaves. So they had a list of the number of slaves per household that owned these slaves that they could know for certain were fugitives. This was an important piece of data. It also asked the number of manumitted slaves for each owner if they had freed any of their slaves over each of the decades. The 1860 slave schedule included one additional question. It asked about the number of houses for the slaves, the number of slave houses. Now, I would like to share with you an example of one of the slave schedules, just to show you what one looks like. This is the schedule showing a man by the name of Colonel Joshua Ward. Colonel Ward lived in an area called Lower All Saints in Georgetown County, South Carolina. He was one of the largest slave owners in the United States. He primarily grew rice, amongst other products, including tobacco, obviously. But because of his vast estate, he had recorded 1,092 slaves that he owned. And these were recorded over 12 pages of census data. Now this contained an immense amount of information. It tells us a lot about Colonel Ward. We know that he's well-to-do, he's very wealthy. We know that he's a substantial landowner and a substantial slave owner. Because of this information, we are able to put together a vignette of his life. Now, the 1860 census saw some slight changes in the way the census return was kept. The census was taken again on June 1st, 1860 now. The population had grown several million. The population was now more than 31 million names that were now enumerated. There were now 33 states that had been enumerated. Since the previous decade, Minnesota and Oregon were both added in 1859. The number of territories increased to 7. This was the first return that really would tell the coming of the Civil War, as South Carolina would secede from the Union months after this return was enumerated. That would occur in December of 1860. Remember, this return is in December of 1860. Within the following few months of the early 1861, several more states would secede and join the Confederacy, while the Upper South, those remaining 4, would not commit until after April of 1861. The census was very similar to that of 1850. The questions were near identical. There were some added material, though. The census asked questions in the category of estate. Remember, prior in 1850, it only wanted to know about the real estate. This one included a question about their personal estate, their personal belongings, what value they held. It included the number of males and females now that had professions, trades, occupations, again above the age of 15. With 1850, we only included the males. Now we're including men and women both. If an individual married or attended school within the last calendar year, so 1859 to 1860, there was a box that was checked. The month wasn't given, but it was indicated that the box was checked if that applied to the individual being asked those questions. I have an example of someone from the 1860 census. This was a man by the name of Felix Darley. Felix Darley lived in Brandywine Hundred. It's an area found within Newcastle County, Delaware. And this family was a large family unit. Again, I don't know the relationship. I can only assume that Felix is listed here with his parents and assuming it's with his brothers and sisters. Further research would have to confirm or deny that information. Darley was a well-known illustrator and cartoonist of the time and lived in Delaware and Pennsylvania for most of his adult life. You can see here it lists all the members in the family household. It lists their age, their gender, those that were above the age of 16. It gave their occupation. It lists their places of birth. The head of family, Mr. Darley, presuming his father, owned his property and owned personal property as well. and it provided the value of both of those in dollar amounts. The following census is 1870. The 1870, like the previous two, was also taken on June 1st of 1870. You can see the population grew immensely. The reason was very simple. The end of the Civil War brought newly freed African Americans now to the voting block. They would now be given the right to vote. There are now 37 states that were enumerated. 37 states were now part of the Union. There were several that were recently added from the previous decade of 1860. Kansas was added in 1861 in January, just before the start of the war. West Virginia was added in 1863 as it was carved out of Virginia. Nevada was added in 1864. These two, West Virginia and Nevada, were war states. And finally, Nebraska was added in 1867. They also included 12 different territories. Now, like this census in 1870, it included a lot of the same questions that were asked in the previous 2 decades of 1850 and 1860. Now, there were some additional questions that you should be thinking about, some interesting ones that I'm going to kind of focus in on. Again, this was the very first census enumerated since the end of slavery and the end of the war. We have far more individuals now registered under the census. It was very similar to the 1860, but due to misinformation, several cities were enumerated twice. 2 examples of 2 cities that had that done were New York and Philadelphia. There were obviously others, but these 2 large urban cities had their census returns taken twice. It included a question on whether your parents were of foreign birth. This was a new question. If you were born and married within the calendar year, this time it asked which month that had occurred, where prior to that, it was just a checked box. Now we get more information. But I really want to focus in on the last question, the constitutional relations question. There are actually 2 questions as part of this. And I want to break into that a little deeper and try to give you some explanation. So question 19 was centered on all males age 21 or older. So if you were a man, you had to check this if you were over the age of 21. This would include former slaves now able to vote due to the passage of the 15th Amendment, granting them full voting rights. Question 20 was centered on the same group of males, but it was only geared towards those who were denied the right to vote. So if you were denied the right to vote for anything other than the Civil War, you had to answer this question. Remember, the South and those southern states, the 11 former Confederate states, were now being readmitted back to the Union beginning in 1866 through 1870. All 11 were being readmitted. This question was not geared towards that answer. However, this question did gear itself towards a prior act passed by Congress called the Naturalization Act of 1850. And this, in essence, covered children of citizens, even those born outside of the United States, who by 1870 had now reached adulthood. This was the question that was geared towards question 20 at the very end. Again, if you were given that right and it was taken away from you, or if it was part of the Naturalization Act of 1855, that question was geared towards you. I have an example of an 1870 schedule I'd like to share with you. This is Samuel Morse. You obviously recognize his name. He was the inventor of the telegraph. I am a United States Coast Guard veteran, and I had served as a radio operator while I was in service, and I was fascinated with the telegraph and obviously Morse code. And I bought this image from an antique dealer as part of my own personal collection. Morse lived in Poughkeepsie, New York, in upstate New York, south of Albany, but north of New York City along the I-87 New York Thruway corridor. And he was living there with his family. And he is listed here with his family with all of the information I have talked about previously. And if you look at the very last questions, you can see him and other males in his family all had checked the box that they all were above the age of 21, were registered to vote, but had not been denied that right. Part 2 will continue with 1880 through 1900. I'd kind of like to have this slide as our slide to interject into part 2. This is from Harper's Weekly. It was a cartoon drawn in 1890. I absolutely love this cartoon. It shows a man taking the census with an older woman who thinks that she actually wants to take her census, not the actual census. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed your time and I hope you were able to learn something from this session. And please join me again for part 2. Thank you.